Welcome to ICOR's March webinar. We're excited to have you here today. We're going to be talking about ICOR's new certification program, and it's essentially talking about our core competencies to be a leader in organizational resilience and what you need to know to increase the resilience of your organization. We're really excited to be able to share with you today our new program that we're launching. We're essentially launching this in May/June, so you're getting a sneak peek at a very new program that nobody knows about yet. We're going to be talking about it at the couple of conferences that we'll be attending this spring as well. I am your presenter. My name is Linda Nelson, and I am an expert on the U.S. tag for ISO 22316 and the standard about organizational resilience principles and attributes, as well as the author of the new, what we're calling Certified Organizational Resilience series. One of the things that we've talked about in other webinars is this definition of organizational resilience. And, you know, ICOR has been around since 2005. We are the global leader in organizational resilience. And one of the challenges that we've been facing has been, I don't want to say a misunderstanding of the definition for organizational resilience, but the multiple definitions for resilience, and it's specifically organizational resilience, and what those principles and attributes are. So as an outcome of ISO 22316, we felt finally that we had a global understanding that we could then share with other people on what this definition is that really aligned to what we've been talking about all the way along. So the definition that we're going to be working with today is the ability of an organization, and you can put in here of an organization, of a community, of an individual, to absorb and adapt in a changing environment, to enable it to deliver its objectives, and to survive and prosper. And I want you to be focusing today on this idea of not just surviving, but also prospering. Some of the other words that you see kind of replacing the word resilience is being agile, being flexible, you know, this idea of agility, being versatile, being adaptive. So we see all sorts of pictures that look like that, as well as, of course, personally, probably some of you are more agile and adaptive and flexible than I am currently, or I was in a younger life. But this idea of how flexible is your organization, how adaptive is your organization, and personally, the people that work for your organization, of course, that's who really impacts how agile your organization is. You know, how flexible and agile are they? How versatile and adaptive are they? So one of the things I like to do before every webinar in preparation for that is to look at what's in the news, or what's in this case, what do we see as job titles? And you'll see here's a job for a business resilience manager in the UK. And to me, this looks like a business continuity job description, just using the word resilience instead of continuity. A second one also comes, and this comes out of a World Economic Forum and a city resilience paper that was written a few years ago, and this idea of a chief resilience officer, really from what we would call in the U.S. the public sector, people that work for the government. And this job description, as you can see, looks very different from the job description in the UK for the business resilience manager, where you're looking at trying to reduce silos across our government and to access resilience building tools and develop a resilience strategy, though it doesn't tell you what those things are. This job looks like an emergency manager, or actually somebody who reports to the emergency manager, which actually to me seems like the emergency manager should probably report to the resilience manager, but this is in Australia, I believe. This is a job description somewhere else in Europe, I believe, where they're looking at business resilience and their program, including emergency response, business continuity, what they're calling contingency planning, or maybe emergency management. And they have organizational resilience as equal to being these other, as well, to be equal to being crisis management and business continuity and emergency response, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then the one I like the most is from PwC, and they have come out with some really interesting aspects. So there they have what's called the Chief Resilience Officer, and that Chief Resilience Officer has three primary roles. One is what you might be more commonly seen as surviving. So the Chief Resilience Officer is responsible for buffering against external threats. And they're saying that this would be tied to the risk compliance role, but being much more strategic. And they see this as even more strategic than the Chief Compliance Officer. And so they're looking at key functions like ensuring diversity in your product and service lines, sensing your external threats, leading coping and recovering strategy, building your disaster, business continuity, and crisis management plans, and looking at building some performance through trust between all levels of the organization. And they specifically call out working between and connecting all of the different risk departments in the organization to look at that program. Then they say you also need to be you're responsible for resilience as growth. And they say the resilience officer needs to internalize growth and development strategies so the business can evolve and adapt. You can see those words again, to a dynamic and interconnected environment, and that your job is to see the business as a set of interconnected systems and to build resilience between those systems. So this idea of bouncing back better and becoming anti-fragile so that you can actually benefit from volatility or uncertainty or surprise. And here is where they're looking at someone who can really sense and probe the external environment and do some future-proofing, trying to get the organization to adapt and change, to orchestrate this idea of collaboration and trust across all departments and using units, looking at improving the actual culture of the organization through a culture of openness and learning from failures. Also, again, they're really talking about building interorganizational collaboration and enabling learning and change within the organization. And this is where I started to get excited when I saw a job description that actually matched what we're talking about, which actually isn't that surprising to me. The person who I believe actually got this job, it was a job description in 2017, is someone who's working with ICOR on our actual course materials. So I believe that either he had a hand in creating this job description, or it was something that they understood for what he was bringing to the table. So resilience is also seen as thriving, and the Chief Resilience Officer is supposed to generate new ways of organizing and innovating by collaborating and co-creating with people and entities affected by and benefiting from their activities. Notice that these two primary roles, 2 and 3, have nothing to do with risk management. It's really about making the organization better. And this is where I'm hopeful that the future is bringing, that we're talking about leadership for resilience, that yes, understands how to manage risk and to harden the organization, but also understands how to help the organization grow and thrive. And here is where they really talk about being resilient as part of being relationally aware of real time and how the business is functioning as part of a larger system, looking at it politically, culturally, socially, and economically. And I love this. It says, and having an understanding of wicked problems. And these might not be incidents, but just wicked problems, I thought was a really great way of saying this. And really starting to look at the wisdom of the crowd. What are your opportunities for the organization? How you can look at your products and services and start looking at changes that they're seeing in the external environments to make sure that you're ready for those changes and maybe even ahead of those changes. And they continue to talk about fostering a culture where you keep that tension between creativity and innovation, where you can empower people to self-organize and act rapidly as conditions change, trying to monitor anything negative in the organization so that you can make those positive, and looking at the core purpose of the business and how it fulfills the societal need for what's happening so that your organization itself is producing a product or service that has value. So we're really looking to move beyond this survival mode to looking at transformational change in the organization. And this is literally the only job description I could find. And if you guys find something else that looks similar to this in other organizations, I would love it if you could share it, because, as much as I like PwC, we don't want to promote just one organization, but I think that they're on the right track here, and I wanted to share this as an actual job description that was out there since mid-2017. So we're going to take our first poll, and I just wanted to get an idea of how many of you have resilience in your job title or description.
We're going to leave the poll open for a few more seconds here. We've got about 75% of the people responding.
Okay, and while you're doing that, we had a question. Is cyber resilience, should it be treated as a separate competence, or should it be considered under business resilience? And the answer is yes. We're going to talk about that today, and talking about how cyber resilience is one of the ways to manage risk. So these are really interesting results. I was actually expecting to have a higher rate of people that had resilience in their job title, but not anywhere else. But this is interesting. So 7% of you have it in your job title and in your description. And so as we go ahead and talk today, I'm really interested to hear, and please put it in the questions piece if you don't mind, and I can get back to you on this. But just to be able to see what is actually in your job description and how closely does it align with what we're talking about. But it is interesting to see that 61% of you at this time do not have anything in there in your job description or your title. So you can go ahead and close the poll. And by the way, we're only going to have 2 polls today. So I'm going to move pretty rapidly through this, but because there's a lot of presentation material and we are limited by time. So what I wanted to make sure that I was really clear about is that this organizational resilience model that we developed a couple of years ago as an output of ISO 22316 is part of the baseline that we used for our competency model. So you should see a direct connection between those two. So we have 3 environments on what helps organizations become more resilient. One is that they build leadership and strategy, that they have a healthy culture and behaviors, and that, of course, that you've got preparedness and managing risk. Within each one of those, there's three strategies that deal with, how you can strengthen your leadership and strategy, how you can strengthen your culture and behaviors, and how can you become more prepared and manage risk. And lastly, we look at behaviors that we've seen in more resilient organizations. Now, since 2007, ICOR has had a certification program where we've had Certified Organizational Resilience Manager, Professional, and Executive. And up until now, we had pretty much one path to certification, which was for you to demonstrate your expertise in one or more, actually 2 or more of these disciplines. So the manager, you have to demonstrate competence in 2 or 3 disciplines, the professional 4 or 5, and the executive 6 or more. And this is where you are really the expert. You've had a job, or you're currently doing the job of the business continuity person, and maybe that also includes crisis management or the ICT continuity or your cybersecurity, whatever those things are. And what we're looking for now is to add what we're calling a competency-based recognition, where you don't necessarily have to have a deep dive expertise in those individual disciplines, but you need to have an understanding of all of them. And so we're calling this our liberal arts approach, where we're looking at things like organizational behavior, your organizational infrastructure, how you work on preparedness and managing risk, your technology infrastructure, and your continual improvement. So this is where we're going to be focusing today. Essentially, we call each one of those areas clusters, and the first cluster we're going to talk about is organizational behavior. And we're going to look at the ability to manage the interface between human behavior at a micro level, the behavior of work groups at a meso level, and the behavior of an organization at a macro level. And we're going to be talking about leadership, culture, knowledge management, agile change management, and agile project management as part of that. When we look at leadership qualities that build resilience, the main thing that we've been finding over and over again is that the person who's responsible for resilience is supposed to lead with vision and be trusted and respected. In order to do that, you need to be able to lead yourself, you need to be able to lead others, and you need to be able to lead the organization. And remembering that leadership is not defined by the exercise of power, but by the capacity to increase the sense of power in those being led. And that's what builds to that being trusted and respected aspect. We also looked at all the different leadership models. So essentially what we're doing here today, and I should have said this earlier, is each one of these topics is what we're calling a competency area, and each of these competency areas is what we're calling a short course. So each one of these topics would be equivalent to about 60 minutes of learning, with another probably maybe a couple hours of resource materials where we reference all of the articles and white papers and research that we found to support this content. And each one of these will be offered as in e-learning as well as instructor-led. So this leadership model that we're looking at, when we talk about all the different styles of leadership, you need to understand that each style of leadership fits a different situation, and a good leader needs to be able to switch them when required. So understanding that leadership style is a tool and not a personality trait. So sometimes you need a heroic leader, and everybody just needs to do what you tell them. And other times you need the shared leadership model. And these are the two, where heroic is at one end of the pendulum and shared is at the other. And in between there's other forms of leadership or different styles of leadership as well. But what we're seeing more and more is this idea of shared leadership. So you're going to hear me talking today about decentralization, about more of the flat organization, about sharing leadership, about sharing decision making, and being more agile and adaptive. And one of those ways is to share leadership and not necessarily have the traditional command and control structure. We're looking at culture. We're looking at someone, as you saw in the PwC definition, who can ensure that the organization behaves in a manner that promotes a healthy culture. And there's different behaviors that you see in a healthy culture where you need to see trust, loyalty, and respect, and this idea of shared learning and knowledge, where creativity and innovation is fostered, where your employees are engaged and empowered, where there's a commitment to improvement, and of course, regular and open communication. One of the other aspects is this idea of knowledge management, and this was something that was newer to me. It's something that I think sometimes we do, but we don't do intentionally. So the person who's responsible for increasing the resilience of an organization should be able to enable the sharing of information and knowledge to enable effective decision-making, learning from experience, and learning from others. So the formal discipline of knowledge management is really documenting and understanding what your organization knows, where this knowledge is located. Is it in the mind of a specific expert, a department? Is it sitting in some old files somewhere? Does a team own it? Where it is stored? So again, is it stored on paper? Is it electronic? Or is it in someone's mind? And then how do you best transfer this knowledge to the relevant people? So to take the best advantage of it or to ensure that it's not lost. I'm sure you've all been in the position where you see somebody walk out the door and you go, we just lost a lot of knowledge walking out that door, and not a lot of other people know what this person knows, or nobody knows what this person knows. So you need an organization to be more resilient, needs to have a handle on knowledge management, and knowledge management needs to be intentionally managed. And so that's why we have put this as a competency for someone managing organizational resilience. You'll see this word agile coming up a lot. So looking at how you manage change, and what we're looking for is organizations to have a formal change management process, and for that process to be agile. So the person responsible for organizational resilience should have a way to implement systems to anticipate, plan, and respond to changing circumstances. And there's some behaviors that you'll see in organizations that support change management. These are organizations that are willing to take risks. They are able to assume new responsibilities and also let go of old ones. And I know that sounds kind of like, well, of course, but if you try to get people to change how they do things, it is not easy. People do not want to change how they function day to day. And as part of that, you need to seek feedback and ask for help. There needs to be a way that you can help others as well as share information. So the other thing that you're going to see is, and I was really excited about this, is that when we're talking from one competency area to another, the competencies are supporting each other. So what's been said as a best practice in one is supported by a best practice in another. So this idea of sharing information goes back to knowledge management. The culture aspects, being able to taste risks, ask for help, helping others, experimenting, being able to talk about errors and failures are all part of the culture of your organization as well. And this is why we say that behaviors that exist in a climate marked by mutual respect, trust, and psychological safety, if your organization doesn't have a healthy culture, you're not going to see these types of behaviors, and it's going to be harder for you to manage change. And this is the other aspect of this is when organizations make good use of its employees' many and diverse insights, it makes it much easier for anyone to articulate improvement-oriented suggestions. And this helps your organization to have the capacity to efficiently identify and implement useful ideas. I'm sure if you're in the IT space, you've heard of Agile project management. It's been popular for quite a while. And this is really, it was initially created to quicken getting software products to the marketplace. But we're seeing that Agile project management is really replacing project management strategies within all organizations and with all aspects of the organizations, and that we can learn from Agile project management. And I was kind of curious to see what the Project Management Institute was doing with this, because it is really contrary to how they have been teaching in the past. So the person who's responsible for managing resilience in the organization needs to be able to implement project management activities that are iterative, where they value communication, where you can adapt to changes and, of course, produce working results. This is just a picture of the Agile methodology that they use, and they're called sprints, which is really breaking down project into smaller pieces where you can get these pieces out faster. And these sprints are generally short, and they can run over days or weeks. But typically in the IT world, they might be 2 to 4 weeks long. But this idea of it being agile in your project management is spreading all across all industries and all functions, and you're even seeing it in the C-suite, which is really exciting. So I wanted to share some examples of some companies that are using this across their organization. National Public Radio employs agile methods to create their new programming. Saab uses them to produce new fighter jets, I should say. John Deere is using agile project management to produce new machines. I'm not sure C.H. Robinson I guess they're a third-party logistics organization, but they use it in HR, which I thought was really interesting. And GE, who's really what I would call pretty agile organization and has been for most of its life, they're using it to actually change how their whole organization operates and move to a more digital industrial company. So moving on to cluster 2. What you're going to notice in cluster 1 is that those things were really what we're calling kind of the cornerstones of the program, meaning that these are things that anybody can do at any level of the organization. And whoever, if you have a leadership of you and and nobody reports to you, you can still change how you lead and how you interact with people, and looking at that whole, the culture and how you manage projects and how you manage change. If you have other people report to you, you should be able to implement that within your organization. So the more people you have that you're responsible for working with, the bigger impact that you can have. The organizational infrastructure is really looking at the organization from more of a physical structure, not just building-wise, but how it operates. So we're looking at the structure and design of the organization, the workplace itself, how it's managed in the facility if you're a facility-based location, who you hire to work there, and how you manage the finances. So it's a lot different than cluster 1. So when we look at organizational structure and design, the organizational resilience competency here is that you're requiring or ensuring that the organization is structured and designed for both high performance as well as being able to manage change. So most often you can see structure divided into 2 categories, tall and flat. And we see that as being tall is more centralized and flat is more decentralized. So the centralized organization is usually called authoritative, and the authority and responsibilities in the hands of leadership, and everyone knows who that leadership is, versus the opposite, which is more of a flat or decentralized organization, where you've got teams of people that are self-governed and everybody kind of operates on their own. And then somewhere in the middle is what we call democratic, where you've got a combination of centralized and decentralized, and it depends on maybe what the activity is and how much it's regulated, for example, might have an impact on that as well. But understanding that it's not an either or choice. And so whether you're centralized or decentralized, or what parts of your organization are centralized and decentralized, should be looked at intentionally. And that's a lot of what we're talking about here today, is this intentional look at the organization. And what is it that you can change? What can you change now? What can you change in the future? And with your role in the organization, how can you have an impact on that now? And how, if you can grow professionally, how can you have an impact on that in the future? So even if you're looking at your teams that are responding to an incident, are they decentralized or centralized? How do you operate? This was a topic that was very interesting to me, as I have children who have entered the workplace in the last 5 years, and listening to them talk about their workplaces and how different that workplace looks from when I entered, the business world. And really you're looking at creating a workplace that is flexible and productive, understanding that workplace design and the Agile workforce, there's a lot of overlap between those two. So you need to be able to manage change both in the work and in the place. And we're seeing more and more, of course, workplaces where people are working remotely anyways, but also understanding that if you're going to be innovative and collaborative, people do need to talk to each other, and you need to sometimes be in the same space. So in order to continue to improve and adapt to its environment, there's things that you need to have in place. One of the things that we're seeing in the marketplace is that organizations are making a concerted effort to align their workplaces with the work that takes place in those. So this is just a picture of a design where you're looking at activity-based working, where you've got a combination of cubicles and open spaces, also what we call flexible office space. I'm sure a lot of you already have that. One of my daughters works for an insurance company, and they're downtown Chicago, and their headquarters is actually out in the suburbs, but they literally opened an office in downtown Chicago, built it with kind of an open space cubicle floor plan with some meeting space around the edges, and they're now designing social spaces because they're trying to get people in out of college to come there and work and put all their IT and analytics teams together, and they knew that they couldn't get those people in a traditional work environment. So they are literally building a workplace in order to get the workforce of the future, in order to be more agile and adaptive and stay in front on the analytics side. And you can't build an effective workplace design unless you understand how work occurs and understanding those links between work and place and workers. And here, if you're a business continuity person, this is where I think the business impact analysis done correctly gives you a lot of input as to how people interact, all your interdependencies, and how people should be interacting together. On the traditional facility management side, the definition of facility management is integrating people, place, process, and technology within the actual built environment, the physical infrastructure. Looking at that, we're actually managing facility risk itself. So what's the risk to your facility? And I liked this double use of the word building resilience and adaptability into your building itself or to the facility. So you have to understand, in order to manage risk to your facility, you have to understand your stakeholders. What are their needs and expectations? What are your physical aspects itself? You've got internal and external environmental conditions. If your workplace is in Alaska or up, northern Canada, it's going to look very different than if your workplace is in, in a desert, or if it's, I specifically, I'm thinking of like data centers and how you heat and cool them. The location is going to make a very big difference. The humidity levels, the amount of electricity available, the amount of water available, all of those things make a big difference. And what kind of equipment are you using in your facility, how you're using storage and maintenance, how people access your facility, as well as any compliance issues that you might have to adhere to depending on what your organization does. If it's a manufacturing organization or you have safety issues for people to follow, just as my example of a data center, for example. Not just anybody can walk in and out of that. So when you're looking at building resilience, it's really the capacity of a building itself to continue to function and operate under constrained conditions. So when people, I'm going back to, risk management and business continuity again, do we actually look at the capacity of our buildings to meet our needs? And when your company moves, are they looking at how the built environment is going to impact or be impacted by the community in which it resides in? I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. But we're hearing so much about climate change. Who owns your building? If you own it yourself or somebody else does, those things all really impact how well your building itself can manage risk. And so also looking at building adaptability into the capacity of your building. So looking at the design and how your building's being used and how your space is being used to make sure that it's kind of going back to the, Agile workplace, is how are those two things linked together, and making sure that as your workforce changes, can the building that you have adapt to that? So moving to the actual workforce, the people that are working in your buildings and working for your organization, you need to be looking at hiring people who can handle stress, who are engaged in your organization, and who can manage continuous change. This idea of managing stress is a really important one. And so when you are looking at increasing the resilience of your organization, you need to understand how HR works. And is HR hiring the right people? And if you don't have the right people, none of these things can happen. So that's why when I looked at those job descriptions, using the word resilience in that, they had very different expectations for who they were going to be hiring. So it's going to be important that your organization has a good understanding of resilience so that they are hiring the right people. So why do you need a resilient workforce? Well, the simple answer is that tough times don't last, but tough people do. And you want to have more resilient employees. These are people that they don't call in sick, they're productive, and they can operate with mental toughness, because they need this understanding of the relationship between resilience, stress, and competitive advantage in the marketplace really does make it imperative that you understand how to increase the resilience of your workforce. I noticed that when you're looking for a job, and if you've been out in the marketplace recently, they won't even get you an interview till you've gone through a bunch of psychological testing sometimes. So you see companies are actually looking at this. They identify if you have the technical competence, and then they're looking at you to see, are you the right type of person for what we're looking for this job? These are people who don't sweat the small stuff. They're able to respond flexibly and adapt to changing circumstances. I can tell you people in my extended family right now that are not flexible and that can't adapt. My father, for example, he couldn't even stand to be away from home for more than 48 hours. Tough to be flexible and adaptive if you can't change your location. And not a knock against him, it's just the way he was. And so he needed to have a job where he didn't have to be away from home. People that perform well under pressure, when it is actually the big stuff, and people who can bounce back from defeat. This is interesting because, how well do people handle criticism? If they can't handle criticism, how are they going to bounce back when things kind of don't work the way they're supposed to? And you need to be able to change your behavior in order to move forward. So this was a really interesting area of study. This is something else that I found really interesting, is the fact that finance, the whole world of finance is changing. And so if your organization is still functioning, back the way it did in 1985 or even in maybe 2010, in order for your organization to function effectively, they need to be more agile in the finance world as well. And we're talking about a financial organization that's dedicated to decision support, this idea of predictive analytics, and performance management in order to make finance more agile. And the reason for this, and it's this Finance 2020, the world is changing so fast that what they're saying is that 80% of traditional financial services will be delivered by cross-functional integrated teams in the future. And the fact is that some of this stuff is already automated, that you don't need to be doing it anymore. It's becoming much less manual. And so we're looking at fewer bookkeepers and more people who can lead and manage decision-making in the financial world based on the fact that we have access to analytics. The digital world is changing how finance functions. And so we're focusing more and more on the analytic side of things. So if you're looking to the future, you can now deliver analytic insight, which should help drive strategy across the economic, market, competitor, and customer perspectives. And this is something that I said that one of my daughters works for an insurance company. That's her whole job, is to build dashboards and things to help predict where they think the trends are going and where they should be planning to save money for potential insurance spending that they need to have, and also helping the companies that they serve to do their planning for that as well. So looking for the future, it's really the financial world is going to be seeing a lot of changes based on the whole analytics side of the house. Moving to cluster 3, which is probably a cluster that many of you are most familiar with, is the idea of preparedness and managing risk. And if you're working on resilience in this aspect, what we're suggesting is that you need to have the ability to ensure that the organization is prepared to manage the unexpected and intentionally manage risk. We're looking at risk management in general. What are the principles and practices? What kind of incident response structure should you have in place across all parts of your organization? How do you manage a crisis as well as communications? How do you manage business continuity? And how do you manage your supply chain? So looking at risk management specifically, what we're looking at is being the ability to implement systems to ensure that a risk is effectively managed throughout the organization. And if you saw in that job description at PwC, that was one of the key indicators, was that they wanted the siloing to end and for that to be an interactive system of anybody managing risk was part of one system instead of being siloed. We look at some common disciplines that manage risk. We talk about business continuity, and these are, by the way, in alphabetical order, not in order of importance. Again, crisis management communications, your critical environments or your data centers, how you manage your information communication technology, how you manage incidents themselves, maybe things that you don't know exactly what's happening, but you've identified a problem. Of course, your cyber and information security. And then looking at companies have what's called enterprise risk management that should be this integrated system, but sometimes it's not. Managing your supply chain. And I'm going to challenge you to start thinking about change as being a way to manage risk. If you're looking at organizational resilience, one of the key indicators is that more resilient organizations are adaptive, agile, and they manage change. So if we're not thinking about managing risk by managing change to manage risk, I think you're missing an opportunity here. And I don't mean to use the word risk opportunity, but it really is, you're missing an opportunity to manage risk. So I would challenge you to start thinking about that. One of the things that we're seeing about incident response is that currently really every incident's local, or certainly in the past, but now you need to start thinking about that incidents are going to be multi-organizational, multinational. There aren't very many companies left that are just, that everything in their company is done local, and they only have, maybe even if you only have one location, you're probably not only serving one location. So understanding that you need to be looking multi-organization and multinational. And this is due to increased urbanization. We've got critical infrastructure interdependencies. Of course, we're seeing environmental change, as well as the movement of people and goods throughout the world. So this all gives you an increased potential for incidents that are going to transcend geographic and political boundaries. So understanding that if you're responsible for resilience in your organization, you need to implement a unified structure to respond to incidents of all kinds. You should not have a different incident response structure for each part of the organization. When we're looking at crisis management and communications, we're looking to make sure that the person who's responsible for resilience is able to ensure that strategies exist to effectively analyze situations, make difficult decisions quickly, as well as having a system in place to communicate to all relevant interested parties. So looking at this idea, we just pulled one idea from this whole competency area, which was forecasting. Because if you're going to be agile and adaptive and manage change, you have to be looking to see what changes are coming. So how do you get out in front of a potential issue or a potential incident so that you're ready for it, not just reacting to it in crisis management mode? So there's all sorts of different forecasting methods. Some of them I think are better than others. But the idea is that you need to make sure that you're intentionally forecasting so that you don't get stuck in this gradual change and become part of the boiled frog phenomenon, which is, the heat comes up so slowly that the frog doesn't realize he's being boiled, which is kind of an ugly picture to think about. But it happens. So if you're not looking and intentionally managing change, you could be caught not being aware of what the changes happened, and you could be hurt by it. Traditional business continuity management, we need to make sure that the organization is capable of delivering its products and services at predefined timeframes and capacities. And I just grabbed one piece of business continuity, which was the business impact analysis, because I really believe the BIA is the cornerstone of the program, and understanding of the impacts to the business of its, if your activities stop, really helps the organization to prioritize the order and capacity level to resume those activities. And those are really tied to 4 measurements, which is your RTO. How long can each activity be non-operational or we call down, or can it be down at all? So this is usually a measurement of RTO, or recovery time objective. One of the things that's misunderstood a lot is the maximum tolerable period of disruption, or what they often called maximum allowable outage, maximum allowable downtime. There's all sorts of terms for this. But this is when, okay, we haven't met our RTOs, when now these activities are going to be unacceptable to the organization if we haven't recovered them. And a lot of organizations have tied their contracts and service level agreements to RTOs, which instead they really should be tied to the MTPD. Because if you don't meet your RTO, you want to have some gap time before it's becoming unacceptable to you, not to be recovered, and you need time to do that. Another measurement of time is the recovery point objective. So how much data can we afford to lose? And this lost transaction is usually related to how often your backups are done. So if your backups are done all the time and they're synchronous, of course then your recovery point objective is 0. But other organizations, you might do it twice a day, 3 times a day, every 10 minutes, whatever, and it's usually regulated. So understanding that is also very important. And lastly, again, something that's sometimes missed is the minimum business continuity objective, or some people call it service level objectives. But this idea of what level of service is acceptable. And in some cases, if you're having a disaster or an incident, or business continuity interruption, it might actually be you might need 150% of the people involved. And this is oftentimes the case for like a call center. So if your organization is experiencing an interruption, you might need to have more people answering your phones versus during a regular day. But understanding what level of service you're going to be able to offer for each business activity. These 4 things to me are the cornerstone of everything that you need to know for business continuity, and that makes it different from crisis management, for example, or emergency management. When we're looking at supply chain resilience, you need to ensure that strategies exist to manage supply chain risk, continuity, and security. So when we looked at what is an agile supply chain framework, we're looking at, what do you know? Virtual integration talks about shared information on real demand, this idea of collaboration, this also end-to-end visibility. This is really becoming important when, especially in the food industry, when we're looking at knowing where your food ingredients are coming from. But it's also important for all things. If you're looking at a data center, for example, where are you getting your equipment from? How is that equipment sourced? And as well as actual people that you're getting. Looking at your how market sensitive is your supply chain? Are you able to capture emergency trends? Are you listening to your consumers? How are you managing your inventory? Do you have a collaborative product design? Do you have a synchronous supply? And then when you're looking at being networks-based, how can you leverage partner capabilities? How can you, are you focusing on core competencies of your partners and maybe being able to act as a network orchestrator? So there's a lot of really good information on how you can increase the security the continuity and managing the risk to your supply chain by being more agile. Moving to cluster 4 about technology, remembering, and I just want to repeat this just in case you didn't hear it the first time or the second time. Each one of these clusters, we're not saying that you have to be an expert in each one of these areas. What we're saying is you have to know enough about it to make sure that your experts are doing the right job. So this is different from our discipline-based certification model, which is you need to be an expert in 2 or more of these disciplines. Here we're saying you need to know enough about these disciplines and about these competency areas to make sure that the people that you've hired to do that work are doing it the way that need to be done. So as the resilience person, you need to have the ability to manage the critical environments, used to house your computer systems, and to protect data and the associated technology systems. So the critical environments themselves, the data centers, the IT, the information communication technology systems that you have within that, how to manage your storage and your availability. We ended up making a complete competency area about information and cybersecurity compliance because it's become so huge. We had difficulty separating it out or keeping it as part of building those systems themselves. So when we're looking at critical environments, you need to ensure that the critical environment will operate under all conditions. So the question we asked is, what differentiates an agile data center from a traditional data center? And the question really became, it depends how you're using it and how you view your data center. So some organizations outsource their entire data center, where others might use the cloud, combined with on-premises data center, while others are completely on-premises. So that's part of your answer, is how do you become agile depends on how you're using it. So agility in the data center space doesn't necessarily mean that you've got new systems, or it doesn't mean the answer is not moving your data center to the cloud, but it means thinking about your data center and your data center capabilities in new ways, and then putting in new processes and maybe new systems to make your data center more flexible and agile. Because your outcome is what you're looking to do is to have a data center that allows your organization to efficiently and effectively add, remove, and change services at the speed of the business, not at the speed of technology, which inside a data center sometimes takes a lot more time because things cost more money. When we're looking at the Agile IT organization, a lot of times we're going to be looking back at Agile project management, but we want you to actually look further than that in order to ensure that information communication technology infrastructure itself continues to operate under all conditions. So we looked at what does agility mean for the disaster recovery? You need to automate to reduce downtime. You need to be looking at how to automate detection and notification of a disruption. A lot of times you miss your RTOs because you didn't even know there was an incident. And this means, in this case, centralizing management helps with this versus the decentralization. So when we talk about structure, you need to understand sometimes agility in this space might be centralization. Also reduce complexity. We're looking at planned failovers, DR failovers, fallbacks, having your physical and virtual mix and multi-tier applications. Try to reduce complexity as much as possible. And then standardize, making sure that you've got a consistent set of tools that you're using across all of your applications, operating systems, virtual technology, and storage vendors. I was teaching a business continuity class a couple of years ago to IT people who are responsible only for DR, and I was sort of challenging them because they didn't have a connection to the business. And so when I said, well, how do you recover if just one business area goes down? How do you get them what they need? And this company didn't even know where that information was stored. So if you don't know where it's stored in your organization, how are you going to recover it? So having that understanding is sort of important. And it also goes back to that knowledge management, is understanding where information is stored so that you can access it when you need it is also a technology aspect of it, not just what's in people's heads. So making sure that you have an adaptive and flexible methodology so that you're efficient in your disaster recovery so that you can really confront unintended and cascading consequences. And so, we're recommending that you use Agile project management in your disaster recovery as well. Moving on to storage and availability, you need to ensure that you have systems in place to ensure that information and data is adequately stored, and kind of going back to my example, and available when you need it. So there's been so much change in this. If you're not looking at 5G, this is going to change your networks. Looking at the rise of artificial intelligence and this idea of distributed artificial intelligence, and if you're not, having an understanding of next-gen architectures, they're really going to break free from the centralization. If you're talking, I still hear people talking about, should we go to the cloud? And the cloud has moved to, what kind of cloud should we have? Should we have a hybrid cloud, or should we have a multi-cloud? So if you haven't even figured out if you're going to go to the cloud or not, maybe it's time for you to start thinking about what kind of cloud you should have, and move on and say, there's probability that we should be using cloud in some manner. If blockchain technology, which is tied to Bitcoin and I can't remember the other one off the top of my head, but it's tying to new technology. If your organization doesn't have an understanding of how blockchain is working, which is happening in IT, it's very decentralized. It's how you can outsource your technology aspects and have centralized control over that. So it's managing decentralization and centralizing the aspects that need to be centralized. And Ethereum it's happening. It's going to happen, and pretty much everybody believes that it's going to be in place for people to access soon. But this idea that the internet will never go down, and it's going to be the new internet, and it's completely decentralized, it's non-owned, and it's going to be something that's going to be used peer-to-peer, which means for your company as well. So it's really important that you understand how technology is changing. As the resilience professional, you're not going to need to know the details behind all these things, but you need to make sure you have the right people in place that can keep up and that can give you advice on where to centralize, where to decentralize, and how to manage all of your IT data, as well as keeping it secure. When we're looking at security, obviously this is a big deal, and your organization needs to stay compliant with requirements. The data privacy haze is really complicated, and it's not just happening with GDPR. And I mean, obviously it was happening through companies that wanted to align to 27001, the standard. But now it's happening in individual countries and individual states in the United States as well. So watch for this compliance issue to continue to grow. You need to ensure that, of course, all your data is protected from information and cybersecurity risk, because all data that's lost is compromised, and all data belongs to someone. Geopolitical factors are becoming an issue, even for purchasing or security purchases. We've talked about machine learning and artificial intelligence. They're going to help aid in identity authentication. I'm using a lot of big words here. Sorry, it's the end of the webinar, and it's harder to pronounce bigger words. Remembering that we're talking about coin miners, crypto miners, these people are there. You need to have a way to protect yourself from those. And the major thing that's happening is that decentralization is moving security to the endpoint devices. And think about how many devices you personally own. Imagine now putting that into an organization and how many endpoint devices that need to be managed. This is a huge job. So in order to handle information safely, we have to prevent data breaches, and you have to keep control over your data. So you need to start looking at new data management techniques and new hardware-based virtualization technology to help service providers survey their customers' data as well. Moving to our last cluster, we're looking at continual improvement. You've heard the word continual improvement in some of the other clusters. You can't, if the whole purpose of managing change is to continually improve. So we need to make sure that you have the ability that the organization implements an ongoing and intentional effort to improve the management of its products, services, and processes. So one of the ways we're going to look at doing that is through exercising and testing, through doing performance evaluations, through management system audits or just regular audits. I'm looking at your other regulatory, legal, and compliance issues, as well as community resilience. Of course, we understand that you can't manage risk unless people practice. So you need to make sure that your organization provides resources to conduct exercising and testing of all programs that manage risk. And I wanted to look specifically at how agile are your teams. Your teams are those responsible for managing an incident. They're also the people that need to be exercised. So what can we learn from agile IT testing that might help us with exercising and testing of all kinds of teams? And the main thing is that we need great teams in order to run great exercises. So you need to build your teams first. And when you're looking at building your teams, I'm looking at some of the softer issues here. Can your team members speak freely and openly? Are they able to count on each other, and are they reliable? Are they able to tell the truth even if it's uncomfortable? And this is a cultural thing as well. It's a cultural thing within your organization, but it's also a national culture thing. Versus, depending on the culture of the country and how people communicate within those countries is going to impact how well and how you can communicate within your team itself. People need to be respected, that they're empowered to contribute their best, not just do what they're told. This idea of constructive interaction, because we know that there can be conflict between team members as well as between teams. So trying to avoid being defensive and finger pointing and building a culture in your teams that are collaborative, where you've got camaraderie, where you've got a good sense of humor and playfulness are okay. Like if you're running an exercise, it's okay to have some fun. There needs to be a sense of belonging where people celebrate and recognize their accomplishments. This all goes to culture. I've talked a little bit about communication. You need to have clear and efficient communication, as well as evaluating diversity, and this is being open-minded. So really this idea of diversity of ideas, perspectives, backgrounds, and personalities and approaches are very important. And this idea of being optimistic, you're trying to plan against something bad happening by being optimistic, and this idea of fighting together is important. I want to talk about performance evaluation a little bit differently. Every management system standard and every company monitors performance of its people as well as how well it operates. And to do that, you need to identify, what needs monitoring and what needs measuring in order to figure out how to collect your data. So in order to enable continual improvement in your performance evaluation, we're talking about what can we learn from agile performance management of people, where this is something we're seeing more and more in companies. You don't have an annual review anymore. You have quarterly reviews, or maybe you have continuous feedback. So you want to have this, if continual improvement is the focus, you cannot have an annual review of your people any more than you can have an annual review of your programs. So we're looking at frequent feedback versus annual feedback, having flexible goals versus rigid goals, or we're looking at collaboration versus dictation, focusing on growth versus focusing on delivery, and having this idea of supportive leadership versus this kind of bossy, do what I tell you type of leadership. So you need to be able to move from this being an annual activity for your organization, for your department, for your personnel, to being collaborative and continuous. When we're looking at the audit practice, an audit is sometimes a really good tool for measuring your performance, and it needs to be systematic, independent, and documented process for how you can obtain audit evidence. So the idea of promoting a risk-based thinking. So if your organization has one or more management systems, we're talking about making sure you have that you're integrated. So every management system standard has clauses 4 through 7 that talk about planning, and they have clauses 9 and 10 that's really your improvement, your checking and your acting. And then within here you have clause 8, which is how you're going to manage the risk within that. And these are the most common management system standards that are currently out there. They're always being more developed. And how you can do that in one single management system instead of having them operating as separate systems. That's what we're looking for, and that's what you saw in the job description for PwC, was integrating your risk management thinking. When we're looking at compliance, you need to make sure that your organization is adopting controls to ensure that all regulatory, legal, and compliance requirements are met. And here's the key, without unnecessary duplication of effort again. So is it possible to take an agile approach to a regulatory environment? So here's where we're talking about, making sure you're doing the right thing and being able to prove it. And instead of looking at compliance as bolting it on just before delivery, you actually do it as part of the process of delivery. And that's when we get back to that Agile IT approach, project management approach. What can we learn from that in the compliance piece? So focusing on quick wins, and we used to say that a multi-year plan was a quick win or was a win, but I'm saying a quick win is something that you can do all the time, doing things, what maybe the low-hanging fruit things that you can do. And in order to do this, you're going to rely on a controlled change management environment. If you don't have a controlled change management environment, it's going to be very difficult for you to do this. The last competency we're talking about here is community resilience. And it's most often overlooked aspect of planning for your organization is that your organization is part of a larger community. If your organization is a floor in a building, you need to be looking at the rest of the building. You need to be looking at the larger community around you. And if you're in a place where your community can't meet your needs and expectations of your organization, you need to move. And so ICOR has a community resilience framework that is based on all of the research, and it's up to date with the research that's being done on community resilience. And whether you're calling it urban resilience, community resilience, city resilience, it has to deal with these 5 areas. And so looking at the community's competencies themselves to provide social freedoms, to provide access to employment, does your government itself in your community manage its finances? Does it provide necessary resources? All of these things are really important. How prepared is your community to meet your needs if you have a need that the community needs to provide? So we're going to finish up here with our last poll, and I'd like you to be honest and say, would you like to have resilience in your job title? Based on what we've just described here as the competencies that you would need, is this something that is of interest to you? It's definitely a change from if you've been, within one discipline or one area, because it means that you're going to have to be uncomfortable. Change, even in yourself, requires learning, and it requires discomfort in order to move from where you're really comfortable at to move in another direction.
We're going to go ahead and close the poll in just a couple seconds here.
Well, it is interesting. I hope that, this wasn't supposed to be a sales pitch, totally, but we wanted to share with you about what we're building and what we're launching so that we can in the future have employers that understand the importance of having someone responsible for resilience, whether it's the chief resilience officer or any other, whatever that job title is, or maybe the job titles entail. And we really feel strongly that it's important that they understand all the different competency areas for that, and not that it's just changing out the word resilience for whatever was in there before. Some of you are going to have to think about it, which is also really interesting, of course, and that's what we would expect. So thank you, Margot, for sharing that. Just to close, and thank you for being patient, I think it's one of our first webinar that's gone over. This is kind of our summary. If you want to learn more, click on the certification link on our website where you can look at our 2 paths for ICOR certification. And of course, we invite you to our upcoming webinars. I just sent out a note to those people that had already signed up for our May 20. It was supposed to be the week before. I am personally attending the ISO meetings to update 22301 in Delft, and they put it for the same week that we had the webinar scheduled, so I needed to move the webinar back a week in order to have the most up-to-date information for that webinar. So that has been moved back 1 week in order to do that. It would be hard to talk about the changes if we were at the event in the Netherlands actually making the final changes to that. So thank you very much. Please fill out the post-webinar survey. We look at those surveys every month. And just a reminder that this is recorded, and if you wanted to watch it again, it will be available for 30 days on our webinar page, and then it'll be available for members after that. Have a great rest of the week, and thank you for attending.